you everyone for joining the session on legal approaches to regional transformation. My name is Mbalenhle Matandela, and I am the Deputy Director for the Gender Equality Portfolio at Digital Frontiers. I'm yet to present our speakers who are talking about legal approaches to regional transformation. They'll be exploring regional transformation in terms of the different regional bodies, but they'll also be addressing the policies that are operating on a regional level. But they'll also be speaking about how women access justice and how African women use feminist theory to access justice, and also how they do it in different legal systems. And so I'm going to ask Marystella just to start and give us an overview of some of the dynamics happening on a regional level and some of the trends, and if your contribution could speak to that.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. And let me just say I'm very glad to be here today. And as a starting point, I thought to look at, the assumptions that we have when we look at the law. And one such assumption is that the law is neutral and objective. But when we have this historical examination of the law, we can actually come to this logical conclusion that is false. Laws have been created by males and they have come from a male perspective. And often this is given with the perception that it benefits the whole society, which is not true. We have to accept that, in fact, there is an androcentric nature to the law. And unfortunately, the legal system has had a way in creating as well as advancing certain gender inequalities in society. And this actually comes because, to some extent, women are underrepresented when it comes to power and decision-making structures. For example, parliament, when you look at justice systems as well as international bodies, we see that the perspective is dominantly male. But unfortunately, even that the laws that are developing in the context, we see that there's this slow pace when it comes to developing laws in the national that are intentional about addressing gender inequalities in society. And what happens is that we're enacting more laws, that's true, but we are doing so without dismantling old laws that are actually androcentric. But we must acknowledge that there has been an attempt to actually develop laws that are actually gender attentive. And one of these laws is the Maputo Protocol. We are now going into around 18 years since the adoption of the Maputo Protocol, and it has been actually seen to have this transformative effect when it comes to the rights of women, especially when it looks to rights like the right to political participation, the right to sexual and reproductive rights, as well as just ending harmful practices such as FGM. And I'll make reference to certain decisions that have used the Maputo Protocol, and we see the transformative aspects of this law. And one such decision was made actually most recently in Kenya in the National Court in 2021. In this case, a petitioner was challenging actually the constitutionality of the Prohibition of the Female Genital Mutilation Act. And her argument was that the act limits the rights of women to choose, especially adult women. And it is in conflict with rights such as the right to culture, the right to ethnic identity, the right to religion. And those are discriminatory aspects about this act, according to the petitioner, that men are allowed to undertake circumcision, but women who are adults cannot be allowed to consent because of this act. But the High Court held that the High Court actually upheld the constitutionality and the legality of the Prohibition of FGM Act. And why is that? It made reference to the Maputo Protocol in its decision, especially the provisions around harmful practices. The court stated that yes, women have a right to culture, but when we look at how other rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to dignity, the right to education, the right to physical integrity, these rights are jeopardized because of harmful practices such as FGM. And there's a need to limit these rights. The limitations when it comes to the right to culture in the context of harmful practices are reasonable in an open and democratic society. And it's encouraging to see that a similar decision was made in the Constitutional Court in Uganda, and it did make reference to the Maputo Protocol. Moving on to, let's say, a context like in Sierra Leone in West Africa, another transformative judgment has been seen in the ECOWAS Court of Justice in 2019, which declared that a ban that prohibited girls from going to school when they were pregnant was discriminatory and in violation of girls' right to education. And the government in Sierra Leone was actually found in violation of the Maputo Protocol. The government, it's encouraging to see that the government of Sierra Leone lifted this ban in 2020 following the decision of the ECOWAS Court of Justice, resulting in girls having access to education. And what has been seen previously, even before this decision, are similar decisions around allowing pregnant girls to go to school and not having their right to education interfered in countries like Botswana, in Zimbabwe, South Africa. And the element of gender-based discrimination was looked at here in all these judgments, that the men and boys responsible for impregnating girls, their right to education is not interfered with, their future economic prospects are not interfered with, but yet girls have to suffer through this. And so this was a transformative judgment because of the regional instruments that we have. Another interesting case is one in Ethiopia, where there was a case that was taken before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And it involved a victim who had been twice abducted, raped, and forced into marriage. And this was under this practice of marry your rapist. The commission in this case held that her rights contained in the Maputo Protocol, as well as the African Charter when it looked to rights to liberty, life, right to fair trial, were violated in this case. And those really, the Ethiopian state failed in terms of preventing the violations to the victim as well as protecting her from these violations. And when we looked at the justice system, the androcentric nature of the justice system did perpetuate these harms, because how this case was handled in such a way that was sort of uplifting the patriarchal attitudes in society, as opposed to looking at the violations that had been experienced by the victim because of her gender. But it's also unfortunate to see that the Ethiopian government actually asked that this decision to be reviewed. And so let me just, because I have a short time, let me conclude let me bring this all together. We see the development of transformative laws, such as the Maputo Protocol, but they are actually there's a tension here with the lived realities of women and the politics of belonging, as well as the societal pressure that women are privy to, because they are seen to a bit to be sort of occupying a lower status in society. But patriarchy is institutionalized within the political decision-making systems, in religious institutions, in traditional and cultural bodies, and this exacerbates the vulnerability of women. We see that even when women try to access justice within the context of these laws that are developing that have felt to be transformative, the androcentric nature of these systems fails them. The law enforcement, the justice systems that are being led by people who hold this androcentric nature leads to women having not actually been able to access justice. So yes, we have transformative laws, which we do acknowledge are coming up, but there's also lack of political will in the regional context to sign, ratify, as well as implement these laws. And where there are transformative decisions that have been made by regional bodies, we also see a challenge when it comes to the enforcement of these decisions. So now we have to look at how to address these tensions, the tension in the law, but the tension in society, and how to address where society limits the transformative nature of these laws in the regional context. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution. I think you made a lot of highlights on the continent of where change is happening and where change is present, especially in terms of the courts that exist, the African Commission that exists to take on cases at a regional level, to take on cases that need that extra hand at actually progressing different countries. And I think you made some examples about that, about the trends. And so I'm going to ask Thuli Zulu, who's a candidate attorney at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, just to comment on what regional gender transformation means and how it relates to accessing justice for women.
Hi, greetings to everyone, and thank you for having me today. My name is Thuli Zulu, as introduced, and I am a candidate attorney with the Center for Applied Legal Studies. So what I'm going to focus on today's discussion is looking at transformation in regards to women's reproductive health rights. And why I'm doing this is that later in the presentation, I'm going to show how it's important for women to be guaranteed these rights and also to see these rights to implementation, because guaranteeing women's reproductive health rights also aids into their development, not just them being included into the economy, but them actively partaking in the economy. So to start with my presentation, I just want to address what we mean in text of including women and pulling them from the margins to the center of the states that they reside in. And so I talk a lot about equality that is also enshrined in our constitution, and the principle of promoting gender equality as mentioned in the African Union, as well as in Partnership for African Development with its declarations and resolutions. It underlines the commitment of African states to ensure the full participation of African women as equal partners in Africa's development. And this is taken from the preamble of the Maputo Protocol. And in enforcing the protocol, the South African Constitution, also in its equality clause, states that equality includes the promotion of the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures that are designated to protect and advance previously disadvantaged persons. And with the history of South Africa, you would know that women in the apartheid area were disadvantaged, mostly Black women, and they were not just disadvantaged because of their race, but also because of class and their gender and sexuality. And so it is important that when we talk about guaranteeing reproductive health rights to these women, we take into account what societal socio-economical circumstances they come from. And so to also implement the promises that are made in the Constitution, we have Chapter 9 institutions, and the Commission for Gender Equality explicitly states that equality is also concerned with a society that is free from gender discrimination and all other forms of oppression, in which people will have the opportunity and means to realize their full potential. And so, as I've mentioned before, South Africa has then ratified several global and regional instruments to this effect in order to give way to the right to reproductive health. And so through Section 231 of the Constitution, states are then bound by the agreements that they are signatory to. And besides these agreements that South Africa is part of, South Africa is also convened in other international conferences where they also guarantee these rights. And them guaranteeing these rights in conferences like the Cairo Conference and also the Beijing Conference, the mandates thereon was to bring about transformation to women's lives with the main focus on sexual and reproductive health rights. And so they also borrowed a lot from the international document, which is Zulu, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discriminations Against Women. And here, the feminists in Africa argued specifically for the lack of intersectionality in the document. And so they argued that this document is Eurocentric in its nature. And so Article 16 of the African Charter then comes in this regard to say that every individual shall have the right to enjoy the best attainable state of physical and mental health. And here I argue that physical and mental health is also inclusive of the right to reproductive health. And it's important that I mention the African Charter in this respect, because The African Charter factors in the rights specifically of people in the African region. And so the Maputo Protocol was then enacted to give effect to the rights that were not necessarily explicitly stated to be of women. And South Africa is also part to this document. And here I argue that the introduction of the Maputo Protocol was a timely one. And this is because Africa has struggled with social, cultural, and religious factors in implementing women's reproductive health rights. So the enactment of the Maputo Protocol is indicative of the African state's commitment to a legal framework that would see women's reproductive health rights to implementation. And so again, here we see a legal framework that speaks specifically to all social, religious, or cultural aspects that may impede on ascertaining women's rights in the region. But why is it important for us to implement the rights of women or the reproductive health rights of women? Mostly it is important for the ascertainment of the SDGs, of which goal 5 of SDGs is concerned with achieving gender equality and also empowering all women and girls. It ascertains the right to health by ensuring that universal access to sexual and reproductive health rights, as agreed by the many countries in the other conferences, are seen to implementation. And also the rights is in line with the SDGs as it further allows women to participate more in the economy. It does so by putting households in better economic conditions. And so women that are excluded from the economic conditions because of poor health relating to reproductive health rights are also taken into account in this regard when their rights are ascertained. And in summary, the reproductive health rights of women are important because they improve their health and also they prolong their lives. And this is so because women are put in better positions to care for themselves and to improve their livelihoods. Also, these rights advance women's socio-economic status by giving them better standing in society. And besides all of this, we can go on and on about why is it important that we ascertain these rights to women in the region. But also it's important that when we talk about rights and we talk about transformation of women, we talk about them as something that women are entitled to. Because you find that in some circumstances, women must go to greater lengths to justify why they must be afforded certain rights. But rights in their nature, as in the codified documents, allows women for entitlements. So as in these instruments, women must be afforded these rights because they are entitled to them. And so now, just towards the end, how can we then, how can we achieve transformation in the African region? As the previous speaker also illustrated how the court's judgment has responded to the call for transforming women's rights, I also argue that it's important that the regional leaders also prioritize women's rights and also have enough political will to see that these rights are implemented. They can then do so by having accountability structures to see to the implementation of these rights. Also, prioritization can be achieved if all the rights as indicated in these instruments are seen to implementation. Maputo Protocol to some extent does give us ways in which you can implement these rights to the African region. And to just name some of the aspects that the protocol touches on is it also means to introduce the gender perspective in all national development planning procedures. So here in your budget speeches, in planning frameworks and policies, women must always take center stage And also women must have control over productive resources such as land, and also they must be guaranteed their right to property. And also they must be allowed access to credits, to skills, and to training. And just in summary, these are some of the ways that we can see women's right to implementation using the existing laws. But mostly important with my discussion is that when we look at women, women have different needs to men in the region. And one of these needs are their needs to see their reproductive health rights fulfilled within the region. And so the instrument, the Maputo Protocol, together with the Constitution and other laws in the country, can be used to see these rights to their fulfillment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I think you gave us so much to think about. You gave us a lot to think about sexual and reproductive health rights. You added a lens of mental health and wellness being included in that. And you also focused on, you know, who is usually excluded from laws, from thinking about laws. And I think that's a thread that actually both Marystella and yourself mentioned, that, you know, these laws aren't written by the people that should, you know, that should be there when the laws are written. So it's usually male centric, and it's usually excludes women. So from the get-go, already the legal process excludes women. So if we have that exclusion, then what do we expect from the laws to come from, you know, to come from such masculinity? And so I also wanted to stress the fact that, you know, African women actually wanted the Maputo Protocol, that it's an actual regional policy. It's one of the successes of regionalism. And you can see how it's been applied, and you can see the successes with the African Charter, along with the African Charter, what has been achieved on the continent, not just in South Africa, but looking at Ethiopia. Marystella, you introduced examples from Ethiopia, and so even in the East African region, there's so much taking place in terms of challenging discrimination, in terms of challenging sexual violence. And you also exposed how FGM is also being challenged using the Maputo Protocol. So you all brought in things that affect women. I'm wondering if Sarai is with us, who's from the Gender and Justice Project. Sarai, are you with us? Okay, no. So I'm wondering, you've both given me the successes and what is possible when thinking about regional gender transformation, and also applying the Maputo Protocol. But I'm interested to know what some of the barriers are, and where solidarities can be formed. So I'm going to ask you, Thuli, to please comment, and then Marystella, if you could also just comment on that.
If I may just, to answer your question, I think patriarchy is still rife in Africa. And even though we have laws that are very progressive on paper, but our leadership is very much still male. And so because of the conservative nature of African leaders, and the misogyny that sometimes is rife within our state, we find that it's very hard to implement these laws. Also because women are not represented in places like legislations, in parliaments, and also in the judiciary. So you find that it's very hard to implement these laws. And so the lack of political will is usually from the sort of leaders that we have in the region. So I think in also us talking about transformation, it's also important that to talk about transformation to take into account the people at the top. In so long as the people at the top have conservative, patriarchal, and misogynist notions of understanding gender and what women are entitled to, we will see very little transformation, even though it's there in paper.
Thuli has said it excellently. I think what I will add, since she has talked about the people at the top, I think what I can add is the people at the bottom, the people in the village, the people in the ground, the people in the urban cities. We have all these laws, but do they know about the laws? Do they know about their rights? Because it's another gap that is there in society. And often the responsibility goes to civil society organizations who are engaged in civic engagement, and some of them are restricted to urban areas, but we need to look at the grassroots organizations, empower these grassroots organizations so that the woman in the village, the girl in the village knows that this is my right. I do not have to be beholden to what society requires me to do. I should not feel like I am carrying, sometimes it's about giving girls and women the responsibility to carry the honor of society on their shoulders, and because of this they become vulnerable to violations of their human rights in the quest to to meet these expectations of society. And so we need more civic education around human rights, and this should not just fall to civil society organizations. For example, in the context of elections, election management bodies have a responsibility to include this in their voter education policies, in their voter education curriculums, to ensure that this is something that is consciously taught to the ordinary citizens. And because of that, I believe we'll start challenging the problems at society that make it difficult to achieve this transformative effect of the laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I think it really would have been nice to have a perspective from Sarai, who works with Access for Justice for Women in Malawi. It would have really been a great view on SADC, but also a great view on what you do within conservative contexts, and also where you deal with customary law. I think another aspect of law that's really important in Africa is customary law and the role of the traditional leaders. So there, I think there's also room for progress in terms of engaging them as actors and engaging them in policy and in women's and gender transformation as a whole. The agendas, so the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2013 agenda, really need to integrate, the rural women, for example. They need to also integrate the political participation in terms of the judiciary, and also in terms of the legislature, but also just the public sector as a whole. I think so many interventions need to take place at that leadership level. So the top, Thuli emphasized, how leadership is so important, and the people at the top are the ones who can trickle down agendas that really prioritize gender. And then Marystella, you ended it off and concluded it off really nicely, just by stating who should be at the center of policy making, and those are the people on the ground, and often they get excluded. So the leaders need to be speaking to the people on the ground and making more grounded policies for African realities. And so I want to just thank you there for attending this session. It's been really informative, and I think you've each approached this topic from. We did it from the bottom up and the top down. So that was very successful in one session. Thank you so much.